The afternoon light of September 14th, 1814, fell through the open windows of the Ashworth townhouse with that particular golden quality that belongs only to early autumn, when summer has not quite released its hold upon the world, but the first whispers of change hang in the air like a promise or perhaps a warning. Eleanor Ashworth stood at the window of the small sitting room that had become her refuge, a faded lavender day dress hanging from her slender frame with the weariness of a garment that had been carefully maintained through too many seasons, its color now more memory than fact. She was 26 years old, and she had learned to stand very still at windows, to make herself part of the furniture, to breathe quietly enough that people forgot she occupied space at all. In the next room, she could hear the excited flutter of voices as Georgiana, her younger sister by 4 years, was fitted for a new ball gown, and through the wall came the particular music of her mother's enthusiasm, a sound that had never once been directed toward Eleanor with such fervor. The Pemberton ball was 3 days hence, and all of London society spoke of nothing else, for it would mark the return of Frederick Ravenscroft, the Earl of Thornbury, from his years of diplomatic service abroad. Eleanor had heard the whispers at every gathering she had been permitted to attend, had catalogued the speculation about his fortune, his coldness, his mysterious refusal to marry despite being well past 30. She cared nothing for earls or their mysteries. She had stopped caring about such things 2 seasons ago, when she had finally accepted that her role in life was to fade gracefully into the background of other people's happiness. The wallpaper behind her was peeling slightly at the corner, a detail she had noticed months ago and mentioned to no one, for who would listen? And besides, there was no money for such repairs. The Ashworth family maintained their position in society through the sheer force of Lady Beatrice's determination and the careful illusion of prosperity that grew thinner each year, like ice over a winter pond that everyone pretended could still bear weight. Eleanor heard footsteps in the corridor and pressed herself more firmly against the window frame as 2 women passed, visitors calling upon her mother, their voices carrying with the particular clarity that suggested they believed themselves unheard. "Poor Eleanor," one of them said with the kind of pity that cuts deeper than cruelty. 3 seasons and not a single offer. I heard Lady Caroline call her the wallflower who wilted before she ever bloomed. The laughter that followed was soft and genuine and devastating in its casualness. Eleanor did not move. She had perfected the art of not moving when wounded, of letting pain pass through her like light through glass, leaving no visible mark. But somewhere in the attic above her head, wrapped in muslin and cedar, her grandmother's wedding dress waited in the darkness, and for the first time in years Eleanor allowed herself to remember it existed, allowed herself to wonder what it might mean to be seen just once before she disappeared entirely into the quiet invisibility that society had chosen for her. The evening had settled over the Ashworth townhouse like a soft grey blanket, and Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, with a candle in one hand and her sketchbook pressed against her chest like armor, seeking the only sanctuary that remained to her in a house that had slowly become a monument to her own irrelevance. Dinner had been an exercise in invisibility, her mother speaking over her head to Georgiana about the Earl of Thornbury, about his £12,000 a year, about the way he had reportedly refused 3 perfectly suitable matches during his time abroad, and Eleanor had sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the chipped edge of her plate, wondering when exactly she had stopped expecting anyone to address her directly. "No need for you to worry about ball gowns," her mother had said when Eleanor inquired about her own attire for the Pemberton ball, the words delivered with a dismissive wave that cut more deeply than any deliberate cruelty could have, and Eleanor had simply nodded and excused herself, because what else was there to do when one had been so thoroughly erased? The attic was dusty and warm from the day's heat trapped beneath the roof, filled with the forgotten furniture of better times, trunks of linens that would never be used, a rocking horse that had belonged to a brother who died before Eleanor was born. She set her candle on a wooden crate and opened her sketchbook to the half-finished illustration of a white rose she had been working on for weeks, each petal rendered with the precise attention to detail that nobody knew she possessed, because nobody had ever thought to ask what Eleanor Ashworth did with her hours of solitude. Her botanical illustrations were her secret garden, the one place where she could create beauty that existed independently of her face or her figure or her prospects. And she lost herself for a time in the careful cross-hatching of shadows beneath curved petals. But her hand stilled when her gaze fell upon a trunk in the corner, one she had not opened in years, and something pulled her toward it with a force she could not name. The brass latches were tarnished, but they gave way beneath her fingers, and when she lifted the lid, the scent of cedar and old roses rose to meet her like a greeting from the past. Her grandmother's wedding dress lay folded in yellowed muslin, ivory silk that had once been white, pearl buttons running down the bodice like a constellation of tiny moons, and as Eleanor lifted it from its resting place with trembling hands, a pressed flower fell from the sleeve and drifted to the floor between her feet. She knelt to retrieve it, a white rose, flattened by decades but still recognizable, and when she held the dress up to the candlelight and saw how the silk caught the flame and glowed like something living, a thought entered her mind that was so wild and so terrifying that she nearly dropped the gown entirely. But she did not drop it, and standing alone in the attic, surrounded by the artifacts of a family that had forgotten her, Eleanor Ashworth allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to be impossible to ignore. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Morning came grey and weeping, the rain that had threatened the previous evening now falling in steady sheets against the windows of the breakfast room, and Eleanor sat at the table with shadows beneath her eyes and a cup of tea growing cold between her hands, having slept not at all, her mind circling endlessly around the image of ivory silk glowing in candlelight and the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that had taken root in her chest like a seed pushing through frozen ground. Georgiana swept into the room in a morning dress of pale blue that made her eyes sparkle even in the dim light, and their mother followed close behind, with a letter clutched in her hand and a pinched expression around her mouth that Eleanor had learned to recognize as the particular anxiety that accompanied correspondence from creditors. The breakfast china was chipped at the edges, a detail Eleanor noticed anew each morning, the tiny imperfections that spoke of a family slowly crumbling from the inside while maintaining a polished facade for the world outside these walls. "I have had confirmation," Lady Beatrice announced as she took her seat at the head of the table, "that the Earl of Thornbury will indeed attend the Pemberton ball, and he has not yet shown particular favour to any young lady this season, which means, Georgiana, my dear, that you must be at your most captivating, your most charming, your most irresistible." Georgiana smiled with the easy confidence of a woman who had never once doubted her own beauty, and Eleanor watched her sister reach for a pastry with delicate fingers, and felt the familiar mixture of love and loss that Georgiana always inspired in her, for she did love her sister, truly she did. But loving someone who eclipsed you so completely was its own particular form of slow suffocation. "And Eleanor," her mother continued without looking at her, "I have been thinking that perhaps it would be best if you remained home from the ball, for we can only afford one carriage and your presence would only— well, the thing is that Georgiana needs room to shine without." And here Lady Beatrice finally glanced at her eldest daughter with something that might have been guilt if it had not been so quickly buried beneath practicality, without distractions. The word landed in the center of Eleanor's chest like a stone dropped into still water, and she understood then that her mother did not mean distraction, but rather embarrassment, burden, evidence of failure, and she felt something shift inside her, some final thread of hope for her family's regard, snapping cleanly in two. "Of course, Mother," Eleanor heard herself say with a composure that surprised her. "I quite understand." But beneath the table her hands had curled into fists, and behind her carefully blank expression a voice was rising that she had kept silent for 26 years, a voice that whispered with growing strength that if she was to be erased from her own family, if she was to be left behind like an unfashionable piece of furniture, then perhaps she had nothing left to lose. And perhaps, just perhaps, if she was going to disappear anyway, she might as well burn so brightly first that they would never forget the shape of her flame. And the thought crystallized into something like a vow as she lifted her cold tea to her lips and swallowed it like medicine. If I go, Eleanor thought with a clarity that felt almost like peace, I go as no one has ever gone before. The rain continued its assault upon the windows of the Ravenscroft townhouse on Grosvenor Square, and Frederick stood at the tall window of his study with his back to the warmth of the fire, watching the grey sheets of water blur the world outside into something soft and indistinct, which seemed appropriate somehow for a man who had spent the last 3 years trying to blur the sharp edges of his own memories into something he could bear to carry. The study was masculine and meticulously organized, leather-bound volumes arranged by subject on mahogany shelves, correspondence stacked in precise piles awaiting his attention, a globe in the corner that he had spun 1,000 times while dreaming of places far from England, and the expectations that clung to his title like barnacles to a ship's hull. He was 32 years old, possessed of £12,000 a year, and an earldom that stretched back 6 generations, and he had never felt more hollow than he did standing here in the house of his ancestors, contemplating the horror of attending yet another ball where young women would look at him and see nothing but a coronet and a fortune. The ruby ring sat on his desk where he had placed it that morning after finding it among his papers, returned to him chapter 2 years ago by a woman who had sworn she loved him and then confessed, when pressed, that she had loved only what he represented, and the sight of it still had the power to make his chest constrict with something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but some bitter alchemy of both. "You cannot hide in here forever," Philip Sinclair announced as he strode into the study without knocking, dressed impeccably for calling on ladies despite the weather, his fair hair slightly damp, and his expression carrying that particular blend of affection and exasperation that only the closest of friends could produce. "The Pemberton ball is in 3 days, and you have accepted the invitation, which means you must actually attend, unless you wish to confirm every rumour about the cold and heartless Earl of Thornbury." Frederick turned from the window and regarded his friend with the flat expression he had perfected during his diplomatic years, the one that revealed nothing and invited no further inquiry. But Philip had known him since Eton and was immune to such defences. "I have been making calls," Philip continued, settling himself in a leather chair without invitation, "and I can report that the marriage mart is in fine form this season, with the usual assortment of eager mothers and terrified daughters, though the Ashworth family seems particularly determined to secure your attention." Frederick felt his jaw tighten at the mention of mothers with matrimonial ambitions. "The Ashworths," Philip went on, "have 2 daughters. The younger one, Georgiana, is this season's diamond, quite beautiful if you prefer the obvious sort of beauty, all golden curls and simpering smiles. And then there is the elder sister. What was her name? Eleanor, I think. Rather plain and quiet. The Ton calls her the Invisible One." "The Invisible One," Frederick repeated, and something in the phrase caught at him unexpectedly, for he knew what it was to wish for invisibility, to crave the simple mercy of being overlooked rather than being seen only for what one possessed. "Invisible sounds restful," he said finally, and turned back to the rain-streaked window, where his reflection stared back at him like a ghost. The rain had stopped by late morning on September the 16th, leaving the streets of London washed clean and glistening beneath a sky that could not quite decide between grey and silver, and Eleanor sat cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom with her grandmother's wedding dress spread across her lap like a fallen cloud, her needle moving with the precise deliberation of someone who had spent years training her hands to capture the delicate veins of leaves and the impossible softness of petals, for the same skills that allowed her to illustrate botanical specimens with such exacting accuracy now served a different purpose entirely, transforming yellowed lace into something luminous through the careful application of fresh white silk she had purchased 3 days ago with coins saved over 4 years of birthdays and Christmases, small amounts pressed into her palm by her father when her mother was not looking, accumulated with no particular purpose until now, when purpose had arrived like lightning and illuminated everything she had been saving herself for without knowing it. The dress had required more work than she had anticipated, the ivory silk beneath the yellowed overlay still sound, but the decorative elements aged beyond simple restoration. And so Eleanor had made the radical choice to strip away what could not be saved and replace it with something new, removing the brown-tinged lace at the bodice and sleeves and substituting panels of white silk that she had embroidered with tiny white roses in thread so pale it was nearly invisible, creating texture rather than color, a subtle dimensionality that caught the light like frost on glass. She had slipped out of the house at dawn that morning while the household still slept, her plain cloak pulled tight against the early chill, making her way to Covent Garden, where the flower sellers were already arranging their wares, and she had purchased white roses from a woman with weathered hands and kind eyes, who had not asked why a gentlewoman would want flowers at such an hour, simply wrapped them in brown paper and accepted Eleanor's coins with a nod that felt almost like blessing. The roses now sat in a pitcher of water on her washstand, their petals beginning to open, and Eleanor planned to wire them into a garland for the waist of the dress on the morning of the ball, fresh and fragrant and impossible to ignore. She was just holding the bodice up to examine her stitching in the pale light from the window when she heard footsteps in the hallway and Georgiana's voice calling out to their mother about ribbon colors, and Eleanor's heart seized in her chest as the door handle began to turn, her hands moving faster than thought to gather the yards of silk and thrust them beneath her bed, the needle still trailing thread as she grabbed her sketchbook and threw herself into the chair by the window, opening to a half-finished illustration of a hellebore just as Georgiana's golden head appeared around the doorframe, her sister's eyes sweeping the room with idle curiosity before dismissing whatever she had hoped to find and withdrawing with a careless comment about luncheon, leaving Eleanor alone with her thundering pulse and the knowledge that the dress remained undiscovered, her secret preserved for 2 more days. Lady Pemberton's drawing-room was arranged for the afternoon tea with the precision of a military campaign, chairs positioned to encourage intimate conversation while allowing for the observation of all arrivals, tables laden with delicate sandwiches and cakes that no one would eat for fear of appearing indelicate. And Eleanor sat in a corner near the window in her unremarkable brown dress, a cup of tea cooling in her hands as she watched the parade of society flow around her like water around a stone, unseeing and uninterested in the obstacles she presented to their glittering progress, and she found a strange comfort in her invisibility today, for it allowed her to observe without being observed, to catalogue the faces and fashions and whispered cruelties that constituted polite society, while her mind remained fixed on the dress hidden beneath her bed and the transformation that awaited her tomorrow evening. She had nearly finished her tea when the room shifted in that subtle way that announced the arrival of someone important, conversations pausing mid-sentence, heads turning, with carefully calibrated casualness, and Eleanor looked up to see a tall man enter with another fair-haired gentleman at his side, the dark-haired one moving through the room with the contained grace of someone who had learned to carry the weight of expectation without letting it bend his spine, his grey eyes sweeping the assembled company with an expression that suggested he found the entire exercise tedious, but was too well bred to say so. Lady Caroline Harcourt materialized at Eleanor's elbow like a beautiful venomous snake, her green silk dress rustling with peacock feathers as she settled into the adjacent chair with the air of someone bestowing a great favor, though Eleanor knew from long experience that Lady Caroline only approached the invisible when she wished to sharpen her wit on a target that could not fight back. "I see you have noticed our distinguished guest," Lady Caroline purred, her eyes fixed on the dark-haired man across the room. "That is the Earl of Thornbury, returned from his diplomatic exile to find a wife at last, though I cannot imagine why he bothers when every woman here would accept him blind and deaf, simply for the pleasure of being called Countess. Present company excepted, of course," she added with a smile, like cut glass, "for some of us have moved beyond the age of such hopeful aspirations. Have we not, Miss Ashworth?" Eleanor felt the familiar sting of the insult, but kept her expression serene, her years of practice serving her well, and she was about to murmur some neutral response when she realized that the Earl had turned and was looking directly at her across the crowded room, his grey eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, and for one endless moment they simply looked at each other. Two people who had perfected the art of seeing without being seen, until Eleanor dropped her gaze to her teacup and Lady Caroline laughed and moved away to spread her poison elsewhere. Across the room, Frederick turned to Philip with an expression his friend had not seen in years, something that might have been curiosity if it had not been tinged with something deeper and more dangerous. "Who is that woman in the corner?" he asked quietly. "The one in brown, who looks like she has secrets worth keeping." The evening of September 17th arrived with a clearing sky that seemed to mock Eleanor's churning stomach, the clouds that had hung over London for days finally parting to reveal the first stars she had seen in a week, and she stood at her bedroom window watching the light fade from the world while her mother's voice carried up the staircase with the particular tone that always preceded an announcement Eleanor would not wish to hear. And when the summons came, she descended to the drawing-room where her family had gathered in what should have been a moment of excited anticipation, but instead felt to Eleanor like a tribunal convened to deliver a verdict she had not known she was awaiting. Lady Beatrice sat in her usual chair by the fire, with Georgiana perched prettily on the settee beside her. Both of them turned toward Eleanor with expressions that mingled false sympathy with barely concealed relief, and her mother spoke the words that Eleanor had dreaded, but somehow not quite expected, with a briskness that suggested the matter was too trivial to warrant extended discussion, explaining that the family finances would only stretch to one carriage for tomorrow evening, and that since Georgiana was the one with real prospects of securing the Earl's attention, there was simply no point in Eleanor attending when she would only sit in a corner, as she always did. And besides, she had not seemed particularly enthusiastic about the ball in any case, and surely she would be more comfortable at home with a book, and perhaps some warm milk. Eleanor felt the words land like stones dropped into still water, each one sending ripples of humiliation outward until her entire body seemed to vibrate with the impact. And for one terrible moment she thought she might weep or rage or beg, but instead something harder and brighter crystallized in her chest, a resolve that had been building for days and now found its final form in the face of this casual dismissal, and she heard herself murmuring agreement in a voice so calm it surprised even her, watching her mother's shoulders relax with the ease of a woman who had expected resistance and found none. She excused herself and climbed the stairs to her room with measured steps that belied the wild beating of her heart, and once the door was closed behind her, she moved with swift purpose to the small box where she kept her remaining pin money, counting out the coins with fingers that trembled only slightly as she calculated whether she had enough to hire a carriage of her own, and when the sum proved sufficient, she allowed herself one shaky breath before composing a note to the livery stable 3 streets away, where she had made discreet inquiries the day before. The note was dispatched with the kitchen boy who could be trusted with a penny bribe, and then Eleanor was alone with the dress that hung now in her wardrobe, complete and waiting, the white roses she would add in the morning resting in water on her washstand like a promise or a threat. She stood before it in the gathering darkness, her grandmother's pearls cool in her palm, and spoke aloud to the empty room words that tasted like both liberation and doom. "Tomorrow they will see me, or they will destroy me, but either way, I will finally exist." The evening of September 18th, 1814, descended upon London with the gentle hush of a world holding its breath, and Eleanor stood alone in her bedroom at precisely 7 o'clock, listening to the fading clatter of the family carriage as it bore her mother and sister away to the Pemberton ball without her, the sound of hooves on cobblestones growing fainter until silence wrapped around the townhouse like a shroud, and she was finally, blessedly, terrifyingly alone with the task that lay before her. She moved through her preparations with the ceremonial slowness of a woman performing sacred rites, first drawing a bath that she scented with the last of her hoarded rosewater, then sitting before her small mirror to arrange her hair in a style she had practiced in secret for 3 nights running, Her fingers steady despite the trembling that lived somewhere deeper in her bones, weaving the fresh white roses she had kept wrapped in damp cloth into the simple elegance of her upswept curls until she looked like something from a painting or perhaps a dream. The dress waited on its hook like a ghost made manifest, and when Eleanor finally lifted it down and let the ivory silk whisper over her skin, she felt something shift in the very architecture of her being, the fabric settling against her body with the perfect fit that only days of painstaking alteration could achieve, the pearl buttons fastening up her back one by one as she contorted her arms in ways she had practiced until they became automatic. Her grandmother's pearls were cool against her throat when she clasped them, and she added the matching earrings with fingers that had finally begun to shake in earnest. And then there was nothing left to do but turn and face the mirror that would show her either a fool dressed for her own destruction or a woman transformed into something the world would have to acknowledge. The reflection that gazed back at her stole the breath from her lungs and the thoughts from her mind, for the woman in the glass was not the Eleanor she had known for 26 years of quiet invisibility, but something altogether different, something luminous and strange and terribly brave, the ivory gown catching the candlelight, and glowing like moonlight made solid. The white roses in her dark hair a crown of delicate defiance. And for one suspended moment, she did not recognize herself at all. She pressed her gloved hand to the cold glass, as if to confirm that the vision was real, watching her reflection do the same. And then she whispered the words that would carry her forward into whatever awaited. "I am Eleanor Ashworth, and tonight I will be seen." The hired carriage arrived at 8:30 as arranged, the driver asking no questions about the woman in white who emerged from the servants' entrance and climbed inside with the careful movements of someone carrying something precious and breakable. And as the wheels began to turn toward the Pemberton mansion, Eleanor sat in the darkness with her hands clasped tight in her lap, watching the streets of London pass by like scenes from someone's life, trembling with terror and exhilaration in equal measure as she rode toward either her rebirth or her ruin. The Pemberton mansion blazed with light as Eleanor's carriage rolled to a stop at precisely 9:15, the windows glowing like 100 golden eyes watching her approach, and she sat frozen in the darkness of the cab, while her heart hammered against her ribs with such violence that she feared the delicate pearl buttons of her grandmother's dress might burst from the pressure, and through the carriage window she could see the grand entrance where liveried footmen stood at attention, and the distant strains of a waltz drifted out into the cool September night, like a siren song calling her toward either glory or destruction. She had planned this moment for days, but now that it had arrived, she found herself paralyzed by the sheer audacity of what she was about to do, and her gloved hands gripped each other so tightly that she could feel her own pulse throbbing through the thin white silk, and she thought of all the reasons she should tell the driver to turn around and take her home, where she could remove this impossible dress and climb into bed and pretend that she had never conceived of something so mad, so reckless, so utterly unlike the Eleanor Ashworth who had spent 26 years perfecting the art of disappearing into wallpaper. But then she thought of her mother's casual dismissal, and Georgiana's thoughtless cruelty, and 3 seasons of standing in corners, while the world waltzed past her as though she were no more substantial than a shadow, and something fierce and bright rose up in her chest and pushed her trembling legs toward the carriage door before her mind could manufacture more objections. The footman who helped her down did a poor job of hiding his astonishment at the sight of her gown, his eyes widening before professional training smoothed his expression into careful blankness, and Eleanor lifted her chin and gathered her ivory skirts, and began the endless walk toward the entrance, where another footman waited to announce arrivals to the glittering assembly within. She could hear the music more clearly now, could see through the tall windows the swirling colors of dancing couples and the sparkle of jewels and chandeliers, and she mounted the marble steps with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else entirely, someone brave and reckless and magnificent. And when she reached the top, and gave her name to the announcer, she saw his face cycle through confusion and shock, and something that might have been reluctant admiration before he turned toward the ballroom doors. The great doors swung open, and the announcer's voice rang out across the vast room with the words, "Miss Eleanor Ashworth," and the waltz that had been playing stuttered and stopped as though the musicians themselves had forgotten how to breathe. And 200 faces turned toward her in a single synchronized movement, like flowers following the sun. And Eleanor stepped forward into the blinding light of 1,000 candles, with her white roses gleaming in her dark hair and her grandmother's pearls cool against her throat, and every eye in London fixed upon her with expressions ranging from horror to fascination to delicious anticipation of scandal. And in that suspended moment of absolute silence she felt herself become finally and irrevocably visible. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but could only have been seconds. And in that suspended moment, Eleanor felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes pressing against her skin like physical force. And she heard the whispers begin as a low tide of sound that swelled and crashed through the ballroom with all the vicious delight that London society reserved for witnessing the destruction of those foolish enough to step outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. And she caught fragments of their poison drifting toward her like smoke, the words "wedding dress" and "mad" and "desperate" and "ruined" reaching her ears with perfect clarity, as though the speakers wanted her to hear every syllable of her own annihilation. She found her mother first in the crowd, Lady Beatrice Ashworth standing frozen beside a pillar with one hand pressed to her chest and the other reaching blindly for the smelling salts that a nearby matron was already pressing into her trembling fingers. And the expression on her mother's face was one Eleanor would never forget, a mixture of horror and fury and something that might have been grief for the daughter she had clearly decided was now lost to madness or scandal or both. Beside her mother stood Georgiana in her pink silk gown that had seemed so lovely this morning, but now appeared garish and overdone compared to the stark elegance of Eleanor's ivory. And Georgiana's beautiful face was contorted with emotions that cycled rapidly from shock to confusion to betrayal to something darker and more dangerous that looked almost like hatred, as though Eleanor had stolen something precious simply by refusing to remain invisible for one night. Lady Caroline Harcourt stood at the center of a cluster of society matrons, her peacock feathers trembling with barely suppressed glee as she leaned toward her companions with the expression of a cat who has discovered a wounded bird. And Eleanor could see her lips moving rapidly as she catalogued every detail of this delicious catastrophe for future retelling at every drawing room in London. The words reached Eleanor clearly across the silent ballroom as Lady Caroline made no effort to lower her voice, saying the poor desperate creature has finally lost her mind, and if he won't claim me tonight, no one ever will, as though she could somehow divine Eleanor's innermost thoughts and transform them into weapons. And Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but she refused to lower her eyes or flee or give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she stood perfectly still, with her chin lifted and her grandmother's pearls cool against her throat and the white roses fragrant in her hair. And she thought to herself that she had known this would happen, and she had chosen it anyway, and she would not regret it even as her heart shattered inside her chest. And then something shifted in the crowd. A movement that drew her attention away from the frozen tableau of her family, and she saw him for the first time since that brief accidental glance at Lady Pemberton's tea. Frederick Ravenscroft, the Earl of Thornbury, standing apart from the other guests with an expression she could not read, his grey eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, and as she watched, he began to move toward her through the parting crowd with slow, deliberate steps that silenced even Lady Caroline's vicious whispers. The crowd parted before him like water yielding to the prow of a ship, and Eleanor watched Frederick Ravenscroft approach with the strange detachment of someone observing their own execution, her heart pounding so violently that she could feel her pulse in her fingertips and her throat, and the delicate skin behind her ears where her grandmother's pearls lay cool against her flushed neck, and she thought that she should curtsy or speak, or do something other than stand frozen like a statue in her impossible ivory gown while the most powerful man in the room walked toward her with an expression she could not decipher, and the entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see whether he would deliver the final blow that would complete her ruin or do something else entirely. He stopped before her at a distance that was proper but somehow felt intimate, close enough that she could see the individual threads of silver in his grey eyes and the slight tension in his jaw that suggested he was not nearly as calm as his measured pace had implied, and behind him she could see Lord Philip Sinclair hovering with an expression of barely contained curiosity, and something that might have been admiration. And beyond Philip, the sea of faces watched with hunger for whatever spectacle was about to unfold. Frederick did not speak immediately, but instead let his gaze travel over her face with an intensity that made Eleanor feel as though he were reading words written on her skin, cataloguing every freckle and fear and desperate hope that she had failed to hide. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear it clearly, though she knew that everyone was straining to catch his words. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like something precious rather than the afterthought it had always been. "I believe the musicians have forgotten their purpose, and indeed the orchestra still sat silent with their instruments poised as though they too were waiting for permission to continue, and Frederick turned his head slightly toward them with a look that carried all the authority of his title and his wealth and his position in society. And within seconds, the strains of a waltz began to fill the ballroom once more. He turned back to Eleanor and extended his hand with the same deliberate grace that had marked his approach, his white-gloved fingers steady and waiting. And he said, "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" in a voice that carried just far enough for those nearest to hear, and understand that the Earl of Thornbury was not condemning the woman in the wedding dress, but claiming her for himself in the most public way possible. Eleanor stared at his outstretched hand and felt the entire trajectory of her life pivoting on this single moment, understanding that if she took his hand she would be accepting not just a dance, but a declaration, a statement that would ripple through London drawing rooms for weeks to come. And her own gloved hand trembled visibly as she raised it toward his, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper as she said, "The honor would be mine, my lord." And when his fingers closed around hers, she felt something shift in the universe, some fundamental reordering of possibilities that she had never dared to imagine. He led her onto the dance floor with the confident grace of a man who had waltzed in ballrooms across Europe, and Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze following them as Frederick placed his hand at her waist with a pressure that was proper but somehow felt like a promise, and she raised her own trembling fingers to rest upon his shoulder, feeling the warmth of him through the fine wool of his evening coat, as the music swelled around them and they began to move together in sweeping circles that carried them past the frozen faces of London society. She could not quite believe that this was happening, that she was dancing in her grandmother's wedding dress with the Earl of Thornbury, while 200 witnesses watched and whispered and recalculated their assumptions about the overlooked Ashworth sister, and she kept her eyes fixed on the intricate folds of his cravat, because she was not certain she could bear the intensity of his gaze at such close proximity. But his voice cut through her nervous thoughts with a question that demanded she look up and meet his eyes. "Why?" he asked simply, and the single word contained multitudes, asking not just about the dress, but about the courage and the desperation and the wild defiance that had brought her to this moment. And Eleanor felt the answer rising in her throat with a honesty that surprised her, perhaps because she had already risked everything and there seemed little point in pretense now. "I wanted to be seen," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Just once, I wanted to exist in a room instead of haunting it like a ghost that everyone pretends not to notice." And she watched something shift in his grey eyes, a flicker of recognition that suggested her words had struck a chord he had not expected. "And are you?" he asked as he guided her through a turn that brought them closer together than the dance strictly required. "Seen," and Eleanor considered the question as they moved past Lady Caroline, whose peacock feathers quivered with barely suppressed outrage, and past her mother, who clutched her smelling salts like a lifeline, and past Georgiana, whose beautiful face was twisted with emotions that Eleanor chose not to examine too closely. "I believe I am," she answered finally, though I confess I did not anticipate this particular form of visibility when I conceived my plan. And to her astonishment, Frederick laughed, a low, warm sound that transformed his severe features into something approaching handsome and drew startled looks from those near enough to hear it. "You are not what I expected," he said, as the music began its final measures, and Eleanor felt bold enough to ask what exactly he had expected, and he was silent for a moment before answering that he had expected another fortune hunter or social climber or empty-headed beauty. But instead he found a woman brave enough to set herself on fire in front of all of London simply to prove she existed. The waltz ended, but Frederick did not release her hand immediately, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around hers, as though reluctant to surrender her back to the circling sharks of society, who were already pressing closer with their questions and their judgments and their hungry curiosity. The music faded into the gentle murmur of conversation resuming around them, but Eleanor barely had time to catch her breath before she saw Georgiana cutting through the crowd with the determined precision of a woman who had never been denied anything in her life, her pink gown suddenly seeming garish against the elegant restraint of the ballroom, her beautiful face contorted into an expression that Eleanor had never seen directed at her before, because one does not waste strong emotions on someone who does not matter, and Eleanor felt her stomach clench with the understanding that she had finally become visible enough to wound. "Sister?" Georgiana said, and the word dripped with a venom that made several nearby guests turn their heads with undisguised interest. "What precisely do you think you are doing?" And Eleanor heard Lady Beatrice's sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind her, but she did not turn to look, keeping her eyes fixed on Georgiana's flushed face while Frederick remained at her side, a solid presence that she clung to like a drowning woman clinging to driftwood. "I am attending a ball," Eleanor replied with a calm that surprised her. "The same as you." And Georgiana laughed, a brittle sound that held no mirth, attending a ball in our grandmother's wedding dress like some desperate creature begging for scraps of attention that were never meant for her. The cruelty of the words landed like physical blows, but Eleanor did not flinch, drawing on reserves of dignity she had not known she possessed, and she thought of all the years she had spent in shadows, all the times she had swallowed her own desires to make room for her sister's ambitions, and she lifted her chin and said, "I have spent 26 years being quiet and invisible and accommodating, and I decided that if this is to be my last season, then I would rather be remembered for one moment of courage than forgotten entirely." Georgiana opened her mouth to deliver what would surely have been another devastating blow, but Frederick stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between the sisters in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. And when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man whose displeasure could ruin reputations. "Miss Georgiana Ashworth," he said with a politeness that somehow conveyed absolute dismissal, "I believe your mother requires your attention." And indeed Lady Beatrice was hovering nearby with an expression that suggested she was calculating whether Eleanor's scandalous behavior might somehow be transformed into an advantageous connection now that the Earl himself had shown interest. Georgiana's face cycled through shock and outrage, and finally a calculating awareness that she had just been publicly corrected by the very man she had hoped to ensnare, and she retreated with as much grace as she could muster, while Frederick turned back to Eleanor with something approaching tenderness in his grey eyes. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "you appear in need of air, and I find myself similarly afflicted. Would you do me the honour of accompanying me to the terrace?" And Eleanor placed her trembling hand on his offered arm, feeling the warmth of him through her gloves as he guided her toward the doors that led to the cool September night beyond the stifling confines of the ballroom, where her roses still bloomed perfect and white against the ivory silk that had transformed her from ghost to revelation. The terrace stretched before them in silver and shadow, the September moonlight transforming Lady Pemberton's formal gardens into something from a dream, and Eleanor drew a breath of cool night air that tasted of late roses and freedom as Frederick guided her to a stone balustrade where they could speak without being immediately overheard by the curious faces still visible through the ballroom windows. "You are shivering," he observed, and before she could protest, he had removed his evening coat and draped it around her shoulders with a care that made her heart stutter. And she was suddenly enveloped in warmth that smelled of sandalwood and something indefinably masculine, and she clutched the lapels together over her grandmother's dress while trying to remember how to form coherent sentences. "I must confess something," Eleanor said, when she trusted her voice again. "When I planned this evening, I did not anticipate any of this. I expected to be laughed out of the ballroom within moments, and I had made my peace with that outcome." And Frederick leaned against the balustrade beside her, close enough that she could see the way moonlight caught the silver threads at his temples. "Then we have something in common," he said quietly, "because I too have been the subject of society's collective ridicule." And Eleanor looked at him with surprise, because the Earl of Thornbury seemed like the last man in England who would understand what it meant to be publicly humiliated. "3 years ago," he continued, his grey eyes fixed on the distant garden, "I was engaged to a woman I believed loved me, but on the morning of our wedding she eloped with a man whose fortune exceeded mine, and she left a letter explaining that she had only ever wanted the title and had found a better offer." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went beyond sympathy into the territory of genuine understanding, because she knew what it was to have one's worth measured and found wanting, to be reduced to a calculation of assets and liabilities rather than seen as a human heart beating with hope. "That is monstrous," she said softly, and he turned to look at her with an expression that suggested he had not expected such simple, fierce validation. "It was," he agreed, "and for 2 years I believed myself incapable of trusting anyone again, and then tonight a woman walked into a ballroom wearing a wedding dress like armor, and I thought perhaps I am not the only one who has been wounded by a world that values appearance over substance." Eleanor laughed then, a real laugh that surprised them both with its warmth, because there was something absurdly wonderful about finding kinship with a man she had expected to ignore her like everyone else. And Frederick's severe features softened into something approaching tenderness as he watched her. "You have a beautiful laugh," he said, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with his coat around her shoulders. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the moonlight play across the manicured hedges, and Eleanor thought that she had never felt less invisible in her entire life than she did at this moment, standing in borrowed warmth beside a man who had seen her fire and been drawn to it rather than repelled. But the moment shattered when the terrace doors opened with a theatrical flourish, and Lady Caroline Harcourt swept through them, her peacock feathers quivering with malicious anticipation as she announced to the crowd behind her that she had found them, the Earl and the desperate spinster, alone in the darkness like common servants. The silence that followed Lady Caroline's announcement stretched like a held breath, and Eleanor felt the fragile magic of the moment shatter into sharp-edged pieces as faces appeared in the doorway behind the woman, hungry for scandal, eager to witness the destruction of someone who had dared to reach above her station, and she became acutely aware of how this must look, the desperate spinster wrapped in the Earl's coat, alone with him in the darkness, her reputation now dangling by a thread so fine it might already have snapped. Lady Caroline glided forward with the predatory grace of a cat cornering wounded prey, her peacock feathers catching the moonlight as she addressed the growing audience with theatrical concern that fooled no one but gave everyone permission to watch. "My dear Miss Ashworth," she cooed, her voice carrying with practiced precision, "I do hope the Earl has not been taking advantage of your obvious desperation. We all saw that extraordinary entrance, and while some might call it bold, I fear it speaks to a certain instability of mind that should concern us all." Eleanor felt Frederick stiffen beside her, felt the anger radiating from him like heat from a banked fire, but before he could speak, she stepped forward, still wrapped in his coat, her grandmother's dress gleaming beneath it, and she looked directly at Lady Caroline, with a calm that came from somewhere deep within her, some well of strength she had not known existed until this night had demanded she find it. "Lady Caroline," Eleanor said, and her voice did not waver. "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I assure you I am in full possession of my faculties, and if wearing a dress that speaks honestly of my hopes constitutes instability, then I wonder what we might call spending one's evenings cataloguing the misfortunes of others for public entertainment." A ripple of shocked laughter ran through the watching crowd, and Lady Caroline's face flushed an unbecoming shade of red as she realized that the invisible wallflower had thorns after all. "How dare you?" Lady Caroline began, but Frederick stepped forward then, placing himself beside Eleanor in a position of unmistakable alliance, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of centuries of aristocratic authority. "Lady Caroline," he said with icy precision, "Miss Ashworth and I were having a private conversation which you have interrupted with characteristic disregard for the comfort of others, and I find myself curious about why my choice of companion should concern you at all unless you have appointed yourself guardian of my social calendar, a position I do not recall offering and certainly would not accept." Philip Sinclair appeared at the doorway then, his warm face creased with amusement and something like admiration as he surveyed the scene, and he offered Lady Caroline his arm with an exaggerated gallantry that was clearly designed to remove her from the situation. "Lady Caroline," he said smoothly, "I believe Lady Pemberton was asking after you, something about the supper arrangements," and though fury blazed in her eyes, she could not refuse without causing an even greater scene, and Eleanor watched her retreat with the crowd trailing behind her, leaving Eleanor and Frederick alone once more in the moonlight, his coat still warm around her shoulders, and something new burning between them. The silence that followed Lady Caroline's retreat wrapped around them like velvet, and Eleanor became aware that she was still wearing Frederick's coat, still standing close enough to see the pulse beating at his throat, still trembling from the confrontation that had somehow transformed into a victory she had never imagined possible. And when she moved to return his coat, he shook his head with a gentle firmness that made her breath catch. "Keep it for now," he said. "The night is cold, and I find I rather like seeing you wrapped in something of mine," and the intimacy of those words sent heat flooding through her despite the September chill, and she wondered if he understood what he was saying, if he meant it the way her foolish heart wanted to interpret it. They stood together watching the moon trace silver patterns across the garden, and Eleanor felt something shifting between them, some wall crumbling that had protected them both from the terrifying possibility of genuine connection. "I should tell you," Eleanor said finally, "that I did not come here tonight expecting any of this. I came expecting to be destroyed, to have one moment of visibility before fading back into the shadows forever, and I had made my peace with that outcome because at least I would have existed for one evening rather than spending my life being overlooked." Frederick turned to face her fully, and in the moonlight his grey eyes held something she had never seen directed at her before, something that looked remarkably like admiration mixed with tenderness, and a hunger that matched the one growing in her own chest. "That," he said slowly, "is perhaps the bravest thing I have ever heard anyone admit, and I find myself wondering what other depths you have hidden beneath that quiet exterior. What other fires burn behind those eyes that everyone else has been too blind to see?" Eleanor laughed softly, the sound surprising her with its warmth, and she realized that for the first time in years she was not performing composure, but actually feeling it, not pretending to be unaffected, but genuinely experiencing a peace that came from being truly seen. "I draw flowers," she confessed, "botanical illustrations that no one knows about because no one has ever thought to ask what I do with my hours, and I have filled 17 sketchbooks with the private gardens of my imagination while the world assumed I was simply waiting to wilt." Frederick's expression shifted into something approaching wonder, and he reached out to touch one of the white roses woven into her hair, his fingers brushing her temple with a gentleness that made her shiver. "I should very much like to see those drawings someday," he said, and the word someday hung between them like a promise, like an admission that he was already imagining a future where they might share such intimate glimpses of each other's hidden selves. Eleanor looked up at him and felt the last of her careful walls beginning to crumble, felt hope taking root in the barren garden of her heart where she had been so certain nothing could ever grow again. The music had resumed inside the ballroom, and Eleanor could hear the strains of another waltz drifting through the terrace doors. But she found she had no desire to return to that glittering cage of judgment and whispers. Not when standing here in the moonlight with Frederick felt like the first honest moment she had experienced in years, perhaps in her entire life, and she wondered if this was what it felt like to be truly known, to have someone look past the careful masks and social armor to see the person hiding beneath. Frederick seemed in no hurry to return either, and they stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the moon cast silver shadows across Lady Pemberton's immaculate gardens, until he turned to her with an expression that made her heart stutter in her chest. "I should tell you something," he said, his voice low and rough, with an emotion she could not quite identify. "Something I have not spoken of to anyone outside my closest circle. And I find myself wanting you to know because I sense you would understand in a way others cannot." Eleanor nodded, afraid to speak lest she break whatever spell had descended upon them, and Frederick took a breath that seemed to cost him something before continuing. "3 years ago I was engaged to a woman I believed loved me," he said, and his grey eyes grew distant with remembered pain. "But I discovered quite publicly that she had been conducting an affair with my cousin throughout our courtship, that she wanted only my title and my fortune, and had laughed with her lover about how easy I was to deceive. And the humiliation of that discovery in front of half of London's society taught me that vulnerability is simply another word for target." Eleanor felt her heart crack open at the rawness in his voice, at the way this proud man was offering her his deepest wound as a gift of trust, and she reached out without thinking to lay her gloved hand over his where it rested on the stone balustrade, feeling the warmth of him even through the fabric. "I understand more than you know," she said softly, "because invisibility is its own kind of humiliation, the slow death of being looked through rather than looked at, of having your own mother forget you exist when your prettier sister enters the room, of hearing yourself discussed as though you were furniture that had unfortunately failed to sell at auction." Frederick turned his hand beneath hers so that their fingers intertwined, and the intimacy of that simple gesture sent tremors through her entire body as she realized that somewhere in the course of this impossible evening she had begun to feel things she had sworn never to feel again. "We are a pair of wounded creatures, are we not?" Frederick murmured, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm. "Both of us building walls so high we forgot there might be someone worth letting inside. And I find myself wondering if perhaps those walls have outlived their usefulness." Eleanor looked up at him, her grandmother's pearls gleaming at her throat, the white roses in her hair releasing their sweet fragrance into the night air, and she felt something shifting between them, some invisible barrier dissolving like morning mist beneath the warmth of genuine connection, and she knew with sudden certainty that whatever happened after this night, she would never again be the woman who had resigned herself to invisibility and silence. The sound of the terrace doors opening behind them shattered the fragile, and Eleanor turned to see Lord Philip Sinclair stepping out with an apologetic expression that suggested he understood exactly what he was interrupting, but felt compelled by duty to do so anyway. And behind him came the soft murmur of the ballroom, the music and laughter and whispered speculation that had briefly faded from Eleanor's awareness, while she stood wrapped in Frederick's coat and something far more dangerous than mere fabric. "Forgive me," Philip said with genuine regret in his voice, "but Lady Pemberton is asking after you both, and I fear the gossip has reached a fever pitch that requires your presence to either confirm or deny," and Frederick sighed with an irritation that Eleanor found oddly gratifying, because it suggested he was as reluctant to leave this moonlit sanctuary as she was. Frederick turned to Eleanor with an expression she could not quite read, something that hovered between frustration and determination, and he reached out to adjust the coat more securely around her shoulders before speaking in a voice low enough that Philip could not hear. "This conversation is not finished," he said, and the promise in those words sent warmth flooding through her despite the cool September air, and she nodded without trusting her voice to remain steady if she attempted speech. They walked back toward the ballroom together, and Eleanor was acutely aware of every eye that turned toward them as they stepped through the terrace doors, of the way conversations paused and fans fluttered and eyebrows rose at the sight of the Earl of Thornbury escorting the scandalous Miss Ashworth while she wore his evening coat over her grandmother's wedding dress like some kind of declaration. She moved to return the coat to him, but Frederick shook his head almost imperceptibly, and she understood that this too was a message, a public statement that he was not ashamed to be associated with her, that he was, in fact, claiming her in a way that society would be forced to acknowledge, whether they approved or not. Lady Caroline Harcourt watched them from across the room with an expression that reminded Eleanor of a cat whose prey had unexpectedly developed claws, and she felt a surge of something that might have been triumph, or might have been terror at the realization that she had made a powerful enemy tonight. But when she glanced at Frederick and found him watching her with those grey eyes that saw too much, she discovered she could not bring herself to care. Philip fell into step beside them with the easy grace of a man accustomed to navigating social minefields, and he leaned close to murmur something to Frederick that made the Earl's jaw tighten, and Eleanor caught only fragments of the whispered exchange, enough to understand that her mother was demanding an audience, and that Georgiana had been crying in the ladies' retiring room, and that the betting books at the gentlemen's clubs would be filled with wagers about tonight's events by morning. Frederick's hand found the small of her back, a gesture so proprietary and protective that Eleanor felt her breath catch, and he guided her toward a quiet alcove near the refreshment table where they might have a moment to strategize before facing whatever storms awaited them. The alcove offered a thin illusion of privacy, a small pocket of shadow created by a towering arrangement of hothouse flowers and a decorative screen painted with pastoral scenes that seemed almost mocking in their innocence given the storm of scandal swirling through the ballroom beyond. And Eleanor found herself acutely aware of Frederick's continued presence beside her, of the warmth of his coat still draped around her shoulders, of the way his hand remained at the small of her back, as though he had forgotten it was there, or perhaps as though he had no intention of removing it. Philip positioned himself at the edge of the alcove like a sentry, his affable expression masking what Eleanor suspected was a sharp, tactical mind, and she felt a surge of gratitude toward this man, who had shown her nothing but kindness despite having every reason to view her as a threat to his friend's carefully guarded peace. "Your mother is demanding an audience," Philip said quietly, his eyes scanning the crowd with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to social warfare. "And your sister has apparently declared to anyone who will listen that you have gone mad and should be removed to the country for your own protection, which I must say seems rather ungrateful, given that you have just handed her the most exciting story she will ever be able to tell at dinner parties." Eleanor felt a laugh escape her, surprising herself with its genuine quality, and she saw Frederick's expression soften at the sound in a way that made her heart perform an entirely inappropriate flutter in her chest. "Let them wait," Frederick said, and his voice carried an authority that reminded Eleanor he was not merely a man, but an earl, a peer of the realm whose good opinion could make or break a family's social standing. And she watched as Philip's eyebrows rose in surprise at the possessive edge underlying those three simple words. "Frederick," Philip said carefully, "you know I support whatever madness you choose to undertake. But you must understand that by morning every drawing room in London will be discussing whether you intend to marry this woman or merely ruin her, and there is no middle ground available in situations like this one." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the full implications of the evening's events crashed over her like a wave of icy water, and she realized with horrible clarity that in her desperate bid to be seen, she had not fully considered what would happen after, had not thought beyond the entrance and the moment of visibility to the consequences that would follow her for the rest of her life. Frederick turned to look at her, and there was something in his grey eyes that she could not identify, something that looked almost like wonder mixed with determination, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but certain in a way that made her breath catch. "Then let them discuss it," he said, "because I find I am rather tired of living my life according to what London's drawing rooms deem acceptable, and if Miss Ashworth is willing, I should very much like to give them something worth gossiping about." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the full meaning of his words settled into her consciousness, and she searched his face for any sign of mockery or pity, and found neither, only a steady certainty that seemed to dare her to believe in impossible things. And she opened her mouth to speak, but found that words had temporarily abandoned her, leaving her standing in this alcove surrounded by hothouse flowers, while the most eligible man in London implied that he intended to court her properly, in full view of a society that had spent years teaching her she was unworthy of notice. Philip made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been a groan, and he ran one hand through his carefully arranged hair in a gesture of amused exasperation before saying, "Frederick, you cannot simply decide to upend the entire social order because a woman in a wedding dress caught your attention," to which Frederick replied without looking away from Eleanor that he could do precisely that, and intended to do so unless the lady herself objected. "Do you object?" he asked, and his voice was quiet, but the question carried the weight of something momentous, and Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, because no one had ever asked her what she wanted. No one had ever treated her desires as worthy of consideration. And here was this man who had known her for mere hours, offering her a choice that felt like the first real choice she had ever been given. "I came here tonight expecting to be destroyed," she said, and her voice trembled but did not break. "I came here wearing my grandmother's wedding dress because I wanted to force the world to see me, even if that seeing came with condemnation, and I did not expect. I could not have imagined." And she faltered, because how could she explain that his attention felt like sunlight after years of shadow, like warmth after endless winter? Frederick reached out and took her hand, lifting it to his lips in a gesture that was both proper and devastatingly intimate, and when he spoke, his breath was warm against her gloved fingers. "Then let me see you," he said. "Let me know you, not as society defines you, but as you truly are. And if at the end of that knowing we find we do not suit, then we shall part as friends. But I rather suspect, Miss Ashworth, that I am going to fall quite hopelessly in love with you, and I find I do not mind the prospect nearly as much as I should." The tears spilled over then, tracking down Eleanor's cheeks in a way that would certainly ruin what little remained of her composure, and she laughed through the tears because the whole situation was absurd and wonderful and terrifying all at once. And Frederick produced a handkerchief from somewhere and pressed it into her free hand with a tenderness that made her heart ache. From across the ballroom came the sound of raised voices, and Eleanor recognized her mother's strident tones, demanding to know where her daughter had gone, and she knew that the reckoning was coming, that she would have to face her family and society and all the consequences of her audacious choice. But standing here with Frederick's handkerchief in one hand, and his coat around her shoulders, and his grey eyes watching her with something that looked remarkably like wonder, she found she was no longer afraid. The reckoning arrived in the form of Lady Beatrice Ashworth, her face a mask of barely contained fury as she swept toward the alcove with Georgiana trailing behind her like a pink silk shadow, and Eleanor felt Frederick's hand tighten almost imperceptibly at her back, as though he sensed the storm approaching and intended to anchor her against it, and she drew a steadying breath as her mother's eyes took in the scene before her, the Earl of Thornbury standing protectively close to her overlooked daughter, his coat around Eleanor's shoulders, his handkerchief clutched in her hand, the entire tableau speaking of an intimacy that should not exist between two people who had met mere hours ago. "Eleanor," Lady Beatrice said, and her voice was sharp enough to cut glass, "you will explain yourself immediately. You will tell me what madness possessed you to appear at the most important ball of the season dressed like a—" and she seemed unable to complete the sentence, gesturing instead at the wedding dress as though the ivory silk had personally offended her, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been compressed for years, finally expanding to fill the space it had always deserved. "I wore grandmother's dress because I wanted to be seen," Eleanor said, and her voice was steady in a way that surprised her. "I wore it because I am 26 years old, and I have spent my entire life being invisible in my own family, being told that I am not pretty enough or charming enough or worthy enough to deserve consideration. And I decided that if I was going to be discussed and dismissed, then I would give them something worth discussing." Lady Beatrice's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, and Georgiana let out a small, wounded noise that might have been genuine hurt, or might have been theatrical dismay. And Eleanor found she no longer cared which it was, because Frederick was still standing beside her, solid and warm and present in a way that made her feel like she could withstand anything. "I must confess," Frederick said, and his voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard, "that I find Miss Ashworth's courage rather refreshing in a season filled with simpering conformity, and I should be honoured if you would permit me to call upon her tomorrow, Lady Ashworth, so that we might continue the conversation begun this evening." The silence that followed his words was absolute, and Eleanor watched as her mother's expression transformed from outrage to calculation to something that looked almost like hope, because whatever scandal Eleanor had created tonight, it was apparently outweighed by the prospect of an earl's interest, and Eleanor felt a bitter laugh rising in her throat at the realization that her worth in her mother's eyes had just been entirely redefined by a man's attention. "Of course, my lord," Lady Beatrice said, and her voice had shifted to honeyed sweetness so quickly it gave Eleanor whiplash. "We would be delighted to receive you. Eleanor has always been such a unique girl." And Eleanor met Frederick's eyes and saw her own dark amusement reflected there, an acknowledgement that they both understood exactly what had just happened and what it revealed about the world they inhabited. The carriage ride home was a study in contrasts. Eleanor pressed against the window in her ivory gown, while Lady Beatrice oscillated between scandalized whispers and calculating observations about the Earl's obvious interest. And Georgiana sat in stony silence that spoke louder than any words could have, her pink silk gown now seeming somehow diminished beside the bold statement of her sister's transformed dress, and Eleanor found she could not bring herself to care about the tension filling the cramped space, because she was still wrapped in Frederick's coat, still breathing in the faint scent of sandalwood, and something indefinably masculine that clung to the wool, still replaying every moment of their conversation on the terrace before Lady Caroline's interruption had sent them back inside, and she touched the white roses at her waist and found them still miraculously intact, despite all the evening's drama, a small victory that felt symbolic of something larger. When they arrived at the townhouse, Eleanor moved as though in a dream, climbing the stairs to her room, while her mother's voice followed her with a litany of instructions about proper behavior when the Earl called tomorrow, about how she must not appear too eager or too aloof, about the importance of securing his interest before he changed his mind. And Eleanor closed her door against the noise and stood alone in the darkness of her chamber, pressing her back against the solid wood, and finally allowing herself to breathe. The moon had risen higher now, and its light streamed through her window, illuminating the woman reflected in her mirror, and Eleanor stared at herself, still wearing the dress that had changed everything, still adorned with grandmother's pearls and the roses she had purchased with her carefully hoarded pin money. And she barely recognized the creature who looked back at her with eyes that seemed to hold secrets and possibilities rather than resignation and defeat. She had gone to the ball expecting destruction, and had found instead a man who looked at her as though she were a puzzle worth solving, a mystery worth unraveling, a person worth knowing, and the reversal was so complete that she could hardly comprehend it. Her fingers moved to Frederick's coat, still draped around her shoulders, and she drew it closer, remembering how he had placed it there on the terrace with such casual tenderness, remembering how his grey eyes had softened when she laughed at something he said, remembering the way his hand had felt at the small of her back when he guided her away from Lady Caroline's venomous interruption, and she allowed herself for the first time in years to hope, truly hope, that perhaps she had been wrong about her own worth, that perhaps invisibility had been a cloak she wore by choice rather than a sentence imposed upon her by fate. Tomorrow he would call, and she would see if this evening had been magic or madness. But tonight, standing alone in moonlight wearing her grandmother's wedding dress and a borrowed coat that smelled of possibility, Eleanor Ashworth felt something she had almost forgotten existed stirring in her chest, something that felt remarkably like joy. The morning arrived with September sunlight streaming through Eleanor's window, catching the ivory silk of the wedding dress still draped across her chair where she had left it in the small hours of the night, and she lay in bed, watching the light play across the fabric, while her mind replayed every moment of the ball until the memories felt worn smooth like river stones, and she wondered if she had dreamed the whole impossible evening, if Frederick Ravenscroft had truly looked at her as though she mattered, as though she were worth crossing a crowded ballroom for, as though her courage had been something admirable rather than mad. And then her fingers found his coat still tangled in her sheets where she had fallen asleep clutching it like a talisman, and she knew it had all been real, every terrifying, glorious moment of it. The household stirred around her with the sounds of servants and family rising, and Eleanor forced herself to leave the cocoon of her bed and face whatever consequences awaited her, dressing in her ordinary brown morning dress that felt like a costume after the transformation of the night before, brushing her hair into its usual unremarkable style, though she could still feel the ghost of white roses woven through the strands, and she descended to the breakfast room with her heart hammering against her ribs and Frederick's coat folded carefully over her arm, ready to be returned when he called, if he called, because despite his words, she could not quite believe that a man like the Earl of Thornbury would actually appear at their modest townhouse to pay court to the invisible Ashworth. Daughter. Lady Beatrice was already seated when Eleanor entered, and her mother's expression was a fascinating study in contradiction, disapproval warring with calculation, scandal balanced against opportunity, and she gestured for Eleanor to sit with a wave of her hand that somehow communicated both censure and grudging respect, and Sir Thomas looked up from his newspaper with eyes that held something Eleanor had not seen directed at her in years, something that might have been pride if she dared to name it. "You have caused quite a stir," her father said quietly, and his voice held none of the condemnation she had expected. "The whole of London will be talking about nothing else for weeks, my girl." And Eleanor felt her throat tighten at the unexpected gentleness in his tone, at being called "my girl," as though she were still the child who had sat upon his knee and shown him her first attempts at drawing flowers. Georgiana had not yet appeared, and Eleanor suspected her sister was nursing her wounded vanity in her chambers, and she found she could not summon the energy to feel guilty about overshadowing her beautiful sibling for one single evening, not when she had spent years standing in Georgiana's shadow without complaint, not when she had finally tasted what it felt like to be seen. The clock on the mantel showed 9:30, and Eleanor calculated that Frederick might reasonably call by 11 if he meant to call at all, and she settled into her chair with a cup of tea she could not taste, and waited for her future to reveal itself. The clock struck 11, and Eleanor felt her heart stutter in her chest, her teacup frozen halfway to her lips as the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones reached her ears through the open window, and she forced herself to breathe, to set the cup down with steady hands, to not leap from her chair like some desperate creature. But her composure was tested severely when the butler appeared in the doorway and announced that the Earl of Thornbury had called and was waiting in the drawing-room, and Lady Beatrice made a sound that was half gasp and half triumphant exclamation, while Sir Thomas lowered his newspaper with raised eyebrows, and Eleanor rose on legs that felt curiously detached from her body, smoothing her plain brown dress with hands that wanted to tremble, and she wished desperately that she had worn something finer this morning, that she had taken more care with her hair. But then she remembered that Frederick had seen her in a wedding dress surrounded by scandal, and still looked at her as though she were worth knowing, and surely a brown morning dress could not undo whatever had begun between them on the terrace last night. She walked to the drawing-room with her mother fluttering behind her, offering whispered instructions about proper behavior and demure responses and the importance of letting him lead the conversation, and Eleanor heard none of it because her blood was rushing too loudly in her ears. And then she was standing in the doorway, and Frederick was there, rising from the settee as she entered, and he looked different in daylight, less mysterious perhaps, but no less compelling. His grey eyes finding hers immediately with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she realized she was still holding his coat, and she extended it toward him like an offering, or perhaps a question. "You kept it?" he said, and his voice was warm with something that might have been amusement or might have been pleasure, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks as she replied that she had not had an opportunity to return it sooner, which was perhaps not entirely true, but seemed safer than admitting she had slept with it, clutched against her chest like a talisman against the darkness. Frederick took the coat but did not seem particularly interested in it, his attention fixed on her face as though memorizing her features, and Eleanor became acutely aware that they were not alone, that her mother had stationed herself in the corner with needlework that she was clearly not attending to, that propriety demanded a chaperone, but propriety felt like a cage after the freedom of last night. "I wondered if you might walk with me in the garden," Frederick said, and his voice carried easily to Lady Beatrice, inviting her oversight while simultaneously creating space for more private conversation, and Eleanor admired the diplomatic skill of it, even as she agreed with rather more eagerness than strict decorum would advise, and within moments she found herself walking beside him among the faded roses of their modest garden, her mother trailing at a distance that suggested she understood more about the delicate negotiations of courtship than Eleanor had given her credit for, and Frederick offered Eleanor his arm with a formality that felt like a promise. The garden was small and showing the signs of neglect that came with reduced circumstances, roses past their prime and hedges grown slightly wild, but Eleanor found she did not mind Frederick seeing it, found, in fact, that the imperfection of her family's situation felt less shameful when viewed through his steady grey eyes, and they walked in silence for a few moments while she gathered her courage to speak honestly, to be the woman she had been on the terrace rather than retreating into the safety of polite nothings. "You came," she said finally, and her voice was softer than she intended, more vulnerable, and Frederick glanced down at her with an expression that made her breath catch, something warm and certain that she had not expected from a man reputed to be made of ice. "I said I would," he replied, and his tone suggested that this was not a small thing, that his word once given was inviolable, and Eleanor felt the weight of that commitment settle around her like the coat he had draped across her shoulders the night before, protective and unexpectedly tender. They paused beside a rosebush that had seen better days, its blooms faded but still clinging to life with a persistence that Eleanor could not help but admire, and Frederick reached out to touch one of the remaining flowers with surprising gentleness for a man of his size and reputation, and she watched his fingers against the soft petals and remembered those same fingers pressing warmth into her cold hands on the terrace, remembered the way he had looked at her, as though she were something precious rather than something overlooked. "I should tell you that I do not know what I am doing," Eleanor admitted, because honesty seemed essential now, seemed like the only currency worth trading between them after the extravagant gamble of the wedding dress. "I had no plan beyond being seen, beyond existing in a way that could not be ignored, and I certainly did not expect you to cross a ballroom for me, or to call upon me this morning, or to walk with me in this shabby garden as though it were the finest park in London." Frederick turned to face her fully, and his expression was serious, but not cold, never cold, not any more, not when he looked at her, and he said, "I think perhaps that is what I find most remarkable about you, Miss Ashworth, that you acted without calculation, that you demanded to be seen without any expectation of what that seeing might bring. And there is a courage in that which I have rarely encountered, and never in the circles where I am expected to find a wife." The word wife hung in the air between them, too soon and yet not unwelcome, and Eleanor felt her heart beating against her ribs like a caged bird that had suddenly glimpsed an open window, and she did not look away from his gaze, even though every instinct trained into her by years of invisibility urged her to demur and deflect and make herself small again. And instead, she lifted her chin and met his eyes, and let him see that she was afraid but willing, terrified but hopeful, and his smile, when it came, was like the sun breaking through clouds after a long grey season of rain. They stood together in the autumn sunlight, two people who had spent years building walls now finding those walls crumbling faster than either had anticipated, and Eleanor felt the strange vertigo of being truly known, of having someone look at her and see not the spinster or the overlooked sister or the woman who had committed social suicide in a wedding dress, but simply Eleanor, with all her fears and hopes and hidden depths laid bare beneath his grey gaze. Frederick was watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, something that looked almost like wonder mixed with a vulnerability that matched her own, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, meant only for her despite her mother's presence at the garden's edge. "I have spent 5 years avoiding exactly this," he said, and she understood without him explaining that he meant connection, meant risk, meant the terrifying possibility of caring for someone who might see only his title and his fortune, rather, than the man beneath. "And yet here I am," he continued, "standing in a garden that has seen better days with a woman who wore a wedding dress to a ball because she refused to be invisible any longer, and I find that I do not want to be anywhere else, that the prospect of returning to my careful, solitary existence feels suddenly unbearable in a way it did not before last night." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome, because she had trained herself so thoroughly not to hope that hope itself felt dangerous, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, and being invited to jump with nothing but faith to catch her. And yet Frederick was looking at her as though he would be there to catch her, as though he had already decided that her falling was something he would not permit. "I do not know how to do this," she admitted, meaning courtship, meaning trust, meaning the slow dismantling of every defense she had erected over years of being treated as though she did not matter. And Frederick nodded as though her confession made perfect sense, as though he too was navigating unfamiliar territory with nothing but instinct and a desperate wish not to fail. "Then we will learn together," he said, and the simplicity of it, the partnership implied in that single word together, made something shift in Eleanor's chest, some locked door swinging open to reveal a room she had thought forever closed. Her mother had drifted closer, propriety demanding supervision even as her eyes sparkled with barely contained excitement at the implications of this private conversation in the garden, and Eleanor knew that by nightfall all of London would know that the Earl of Thornbury had called upon the scandalous Miss Ashworth the very morning after the ball, that speculation would run rampant about his intentions, that Lady Caroline would sharpen her claws, and the gossips would circle like vultures, waiting to see if this unexpected development would end in triumph or tragedy. But standing here with Frederick's coat still warm in her memory and his eyes still holding hers with that mixture of caution and hope, Eleanor found she did not care what society thought, found that she had already risked everything, and somehow emerged not destroyed but transformed, and whatever came next, she would face it not as the invisible woman she had been, but as someone who had demanded to be seen and been answered by a man brave enough to truly look. The days that followed Frederick's first call took on a quality that Eleanor could only describe as dreamlike, each morning bringing fresh flowers from his hothouse, and each afternoon bringing the man himself to walk with her through the modest garden or sit with her in the parlour while her mother hovered nearby with an expression of barely contained triumph that Eleanor tried not to find irritating, given that Lady Beatrice had spent years treating her as an afterthought, and now suddenly discovered maternal pride in her overlooked middle daughter. Frederick came every day without fail, his carriage appearing at precisely 3 in the afternoon, as though he had counted the hours until propriety would permit him to call again. And Eleanor found herself watching the clock from noon onward, her heart beating faster as the hands crept toward the hour that would bring him back to her, this man who had crossed a ballroom for her and continued crossing every barrier that society placed between an earl and a woman who should have been beneath his notice. They talked of everything and nothing, discovering shared opinions on literature and divergent views on politics that led to spirited debates her mother found alarming. But Frederick seemed to relish, his grey eyes lighting with something like joy when Eleanor refused to defer to his position and instead argued her point with the same stubborn determination that had carried her into the Pemberton ball in a wedding dress. He brought her books he thought she would enjoy and asked to see her botanical illustrations, studying them with genuine interest rather than the polite dismissal she had expected. And when he declared her work remarkable, she felt something bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with being truly seen by someone whose opinion had come to matter more than she had ever intended to allow. The gossip continued to swirl through London drawing rooms, Lady Caroline Harcourt leading the charge with insinuations about desperation and scheming and the impossibility of any honourable intention on the Earl's part. But Frederick seemed utterly indifferent to the whispers, appearing at public events with Eleanor on his arm, as though daring anyone to question his choices. And slowly, the tone of the gossip began to shift from mockery to grudging fascination, as society realized that the cold Earl of Thornbury had apparently found something in the invisible Ashworth sister that captivated him beyond all expectation. Georgiana remained wounded and distant, her own prospects dimmed by the scandal of her sister's dramatic entrance and the subsequent capture of the prize she had considered rightfully hers, and Eleanor felt genuine sorrow for the breach between them, even as she refused to apologize for finally demanding a place in the world that had so long denied her one. And she hoped that time would heal what jealousy had torn, that someday her sister might understand that Eleanor's victory had not been about defeating her, but about surviving the slow death of invisibility. Philip Sinclair became a regular presence as well, his warmth and easy manner providing counterbalance to Frederick's more reserved nature, and Eleanor found herself genuinely liking the man who had apparently spent years trying to coax his friend back into the land of the living.